Hi, this is Brooke Meyer, and today I'm going to be talking about environmental classism in the zero waste and minimalist movement. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just what is environmental classism. According to the New Mexico Department of Health, this is the result of and the process by which implementation of environmental policy creates intended or unintended consequences, which have disproportionate impacts, either bad or good, on lower income persons, populations, or communities. Flawed policies, formation processes, coupled with agency norms, priorities, traditions, and professional biases often make implementation subject to these disproportionate consequences. So even though this is a very legal perspective and definition, there is great examples of this through legal things in history. One very prevalent one is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And this is a great example of environmental classism because Flint, Michigan was low income, majority Black neighborhood. And the government really did nothing for years to give the city clean water because it wasn't considered high priority because of the people there and not having a lot of money or resources to really fight back. So, though this definition of environmental classism refers to legal actions and policy created by both local and federal government, movements or ideas within society, such as the zero waste and minimalist movements, can definitely have these classist norms, priorities, traditions, or biases that the New Mexico Department of Health mentions. And these biases and traditions can make it difficult for a lot of people, especially low income people, to participate in these types of movements. The zero waste movement in particular emphasizes a lot of aesthetics to go on with the ideology and has heavy emphasis on products and lifestyle choices that are economically impossible or just difficult for many people struggling from poverty or simply those who just can't afford to buy those things. Moving on to conflict theory within environmental classism, conflict theory itself looks at society as a competition for limited resources. So it is inspired by a lot of Karl Marx's writings and focuses on how society responds to and is built on these unequal distribution of resources. Classism in itself is directly related to the conflict theory because it focuses on unequal distribution of wealth, which is definitely the most prolific and used resources in many industrialized societies, including the United States. So environmental classism deals with a variety of topics. The first being food deserts. And food deserts are defined as places where there is less access to supermarkets. So a lot of times food deserts start existing because of transportation challenges, income inequality, and some places are viewed as risky areas to invest for these types of supermarkets and businesses. And this leads with a lot of people in some communities not having any access to supermarkets and rely on things like gas stations or transportation that isn't super reliable to get their food. So that can put them in a pretty dangerous situation. Moving on, another topic within environmental classism is hazardous dumping sites. There has been a lot of research done that shows minority and low-income neighborhoods are specifically targeted by companies and lawmakers to be designated areas to dump toxic waste. And these dumpings can really heavily pollute the area. According to the University of Michigan, the communities are often targeted because they are seen as the path of least resistance, according to the article. And it's because these communities don't have access to the social, political, and legal resources in order to actually stand up against the million-dollar corporations who fund these laws. And this again relates back to conflict theory because these people don't have the resources and money to stand up for themselves. And so that leaves the people with all the money to make decisions. And that is usually at the cost of minority and low income groups. And a great example of the hazardous waste dumping site goes back again to Flint, Michigan, and how their crisis there wasn't treated for a while. The third example of environmental classism that I'll be focusing specifically on today is the zero waste and minimalist movements and classism within that. So environmental classism has really deep roots within the zero waste and minimalist movements. But to fully understand what these roots are and how they relate to conflict theory, I think it's important to understand what these movements are and also what they look like is really important. So what is the zero waste and minimalist lifestyles, and what are those movements and what do they look like? So the zero waste movement is basically to focus on creating little to no waste and limiting consumerism. So a really big thing that is like seen within the zero waste movement are these little jars that contain people's garbage for years. And it is like showing just how little waste they've created over the past couple of years. And these are a super common image associated with it. Another image associated with this movement is the zero waste bulk stores that have risen in popularity over the past several years. So they focus on buying sustainably sourced products that are carbon neutral or negative and being products that can be used time and time again. Another focus is buying and eating foods that are usually like vegan or just sustainably produced in general. And then the other like topic I'll be focusing on is the minimalism. And minimalism is another lifestyle movement where you try to stick to the necessities and have a small amount of possessions. It is often used as a counter to consumerism and can focus on more internal forms of happiness. It is often accompanied by like more self-aware and reflectiveness, and it is simple in like design as well. A big inspiration for this movement was actually Marie Kondo, who is pictured in the middle there. And she like came up with the KonMari cleaning method, which is getting rid of possessions that don't actively spark joy. And though her method was a big inspiration for this movement, it is actually not the same as minimalism, because the focus of the KonMari method is to just get rid of items that don't spark joy, while the focus of the minimalism movement is to get rid of the majority of items that you just don't need. But owning less doesn't really seem like a difficult movement to participate in if you're poor. So to understand how these movements are classist, we need to look at the aesthetic aspects that are really emphasized with each movement, especially with social media platforms and in pulp culture, as well as look at the double standards within them that can make it really difficult for low people to participate in these movements, especially online. So what do these movements actually look like? So the movements have been glamorized through social media influencers, and though the sustainable aspects of each movement are both very good, the glamorized aesthetics that come along with each of them can really put a damper on who's able to participate. So oftentimes this glamorization can lead to people doing unsustainable things just to fit the visions of what zero waste is supposed to look like. So in the middle, I have Shelby Orm, known as Shell Bizzle on YouTube. And she's a popular zero waste advocate and vlogger online. And she kind of talked about how she fell into something called the jar trap. And because jars are the most common, like zero waste and environmental friendly way to store things, and that's like the most aesthetic thing, and that's what we see online all the time, a lot of people wanting to join this movement buy a ton of jars instead of using the perfectly good Tupperware that they actually already have on hand at home. And she mentions how she feels pressured or felt pressured to splurge on glass jars in order to start participating in her zero waste journey. In addition to these trends, many companies have decided to hop on the eco bandwagon, which often leads to greenwashing. So greenwashing is essentially when companies claim to either be helping the environment and being sustainable without actually doing so, or they can also just imply it through packaging without directly saying so. So Shelby Orm, who I previously mentioned, who fell into the jar trap, also posts a lot of videos on her channel about just reviewing different companies and just helping you get through greenwashing to see what actually is sustainable and what is just kind of putting that message out there, whether directly or indirectly. So one way to greenwash, like I said before, is claiming to helping the environment without actually doing so. And just like this picture I have here, the company claims to be using paper bottles, but when you cut it open, you can see that it's actually just plastic inside. This does happen, but it's pretty rare. A more common form of greenwashing is just through advertisement in general. You'll see a lot of this through the product design. Companies will use green colors, pictures of nature, or throw in some buzzwords like pure, natural, clean, or bio, which none of which actually have any government regulations on and about how they're used in forms of advertising and meaning. And so a lot of the social media and company advertising leaves the focus of these movements on products rather than the ideas and values they're founded on. So because of this, we start to bridge into classism. Most of these products are significantly more expensive, and there can be toxicity online for people using non-environmentally friendly products without taking into account the economic privilege of being able to do so. So the first thing is definitely something we've all seen, which is the water bottles. This is one of the most ways that people look at to be sustainable is through carrying reusable water bottles. Just one reusable water bottle will be $30 versus about $1.50 that what a plastic one would get you. Moving on to shampoo bars, which have gained a lot of popularity recently. These are $20 for a bar versus a $7 big bottle of shampoo you can get at like Walmart or other stores like that. Going on to fresh food is actually really interesting. Fresh food is on average $500 more expensive every year than eating a processed diet. And eating these processed diets, even though it is much cheaper, leads to a lot of health problems. And because low-income people rely on these foods because they can't afford a fresher, healthier diet, it can lead to different health problems. And they also, a lot of the times, can't afford good health care. So it really is just a trap and a cycle that is very difficult to get out of. Moving on to oat milk, which has been super popular recently, especially in coffees and lattes and things like that. Oat milk is pretty significantly more expensive than cow milk, which I'm sure if you've gone to a store, you've noticed. Where $4 can get you a 52-ounce container of oat milk, the same $4 will get you over twice as much of just regular dairy milk. So the jars, a mason jar or a pack of them are super expensive, but they're usually around $5. But using the Tupperware or we're using plastic bags from the grocery store, things like that are completely free. They're just not seen as aesthetic as some of these other options. And lastly, I have a eco-friendly dish brush, which is $8, where a regular plastic sponge is usually only around $2. So people say that investing in zero waste is a lot cheaper, which is partially true, because when you make these initial investments, you're not spending money over and over again, to example, buying a new water bottle every time. But to have these things to reuse, you have to be able to afford the upfront investment. Like a water bottle can be pretty expensive at first if you want a good one that's insulated. So because when you're low income, you can't really afford to save up for these things because you're stuck buying things that you need right away. Poverty kind of becomes cyclical, and those with power and money make the decisions and kind of create systems to keep people in the cycle of poverty in order to keep their own power, which directly relates into conflict theory. In addition to how expensive it is, the pressure put on people in the movement to fit into a certain aesthetic leads to a lot of shaming of those who still want to live a zero waste lifestyle, but do it with things they already have on hand. This kind of directly leads us into my next topic, which is actually the prejudice within the zero waste movement. So going on to that, some of the first things you notice, which I kind of briefly mentioned about before, is with the containers. Well, using containers that you already have at home is just as eco as putting things in glass jars that you have. It is a lot more affordable as well to use containers you already have, but they are often seen as like trashy or just not as classy, and they're seen as cheap. And even though both of these images are environmentally friendly, the one on the right that is more affordable and accessible is definitely viewed a lot differently and more negatively than the glass jars on the left. This prejudice can also be seen through the glorification of van style life, which has become really prominent recently on social media platforms like YouTube and TikTok. And people are deciding to live out of their vans to travel or for environmentally friendly living purposes, and they're praised for doing so. There has been an influx of people buying and renovating vans or buses to live out of, and people are really interested in watching others choose this lifestyle. However, when others are forced to live in their cars because they can't afford housing, they are seen in a much more negative light, despite both of these people living out of vehicles. It comes back to whether, like, having a choice, whether choosing to live in a van versus having to live in your car. And even though they are pretty similar, just because of classism, they are seen so differently. Another double standard that is really noticeable is within the minimalist movement. When people choose to get rid of their possessions, it's a lifestyle and aesthetic choice. But when people can't afford luxurious items or just have few items in their home because they can't afford it, they're often like pitied or shamed. And people definitely view these things super differently. So all of these different points combined highlight the not so pretty side of both of these movements. And despite how helpful these ideas are and can be for helping the environment, it is important to recognize the economic privilege of being able to do so in the aesthetic way that is shared online. I think it's also important to raise awareness to this, I guess. So as a community of zero waste people and minimalists, people can kind of start to notice that even if this lifestyle might not look so pretty, it can still be really helpful to the environment. So some of the sources that I used for this assignment was some articles from the University of Arizona, one from Harvard, one from the New Mexico Department of Health, one from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, one from Columbia University, and another from the University of Michigan News. So thank you. And that was my final project for sociology on environmental classism in the zero waste and minimalist movement. So thank you.